He had no complaints about the good food they had there. We're at the end of the 25th chapter of Genesis. Remember, there's that phrase that's repeated throughout the book of Genesis. These are the records of the generations of so-and-so. And that's a theme that runs all the way through the book of Genesis. And so there in verse 19 of chapter 25, these are the records of the generations of Isaac. How old was Isaac when he married Rebekah? 40. Chuck, how old was Rebekah when she married Isaac? Okay, he usually finds those things out for us, exactly the age of these people. But
actually, I did look.
You did look.
I did look, and they concluded that there was not
Insufficient.
any official
Okay.
age.
Insufficient evidence. In verse 21, we encounter something that's really common throughout the Bible, and what's that? Barren. That Rebekah could not have children. Why do you think that's so common throughout the Old and even on into the New Testament?
I don't know, even now it's pretty common nowadays.
Well, the being barren part is, but the fact that they pray to God and God enables them to conceive. I think it shows God's participation in His plan, that this did not happen except by God's intervention. And over and over and over again, we see that happening with from Sarah to Rebekah to Rachel and Hannah and so many different people, and on into Elizabeth in the New Testament. And so it's I think it's just an evidence of God's involvement, that God is in charge. Now, God foretells something about Rebekah's children. What does He say? There are two nations. They're struggling within her, and God said, there are two nations in your womb. And what would be the relationship between the two? One will be stronger, and the older is the one that will serve the younger. So the younger one is going to be stronger. I don't know. If you said if someone said you're going to have two nations, you might backtrack. But he's talking about the eventual outcome. But he says ahead of time that the older one's going to serve the younger. And the first one was born, and what's his description? He's red all over and hair like a hairy garment. You know, everybody thinks their babies are beautiful. Apparently Esau has to do with texture, with roughness. And so it was this roughness like a hairy garment that gave him his name Esau. And then his brother came out, but what were they already doing? He was already hanging on to his heel. Jacob was hanging on to Esau's heel. And so his name was called Jacob, which means someone who supplants somebody else. And literally what it means is someone who grabs the heel of somebody else, because they're grabbing hold of them to take their place. And so you see the relationship between these two from the beginning. The rest of that chapter is the first bad encounter between the two brothers that we have a record of. What's Esau's vocation as he grows up? He is a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob is a peaceful man. Or some of your translations might say something else. Quiet. The word apparently means perfect, but not in a moral sense. The kind of job that he chose was considered the perfect job, being a keeper of flocks and so forth. And so he was he was quietly involved in a good profession, but Esau was a hunter. What was the attitude of the parents toward their children? Isaac loved Esau because he liked wild game, and Rebekah loved Jacob. This is a formula for disaster. When you have two parents, two children, one parent loves one child and the other parent loves the other child.
There's not even a united front.
What's that?
There's not even a united front.
Yeah. And so Jacob is cooking some stew, and Esau comes into the field, and from the field, and he's famished. And what does Esau say to Jacob?
Let me have a swallow of that red.
Give me a swallow of that red stuff there, because I am famished. And so he was also, in addition to Esau, he was called Edom, which has to do with the color red. And Jacob said, okay, I'll be glad to do that if he's not getting mad and leaving. He's a fisherman in a thing downstairs. We didn't say anything to upset him. He's helping out with the class. What? Sell me your birthright. Now, what was the birthright? How did that work? The firstborn had what privilege? He would get a double portion of the inheritance. And so he would get twice as much as any of the other people inheriting would get. Why would they do that? Well, that wouldn't get parceled out and dissipate. You know, an inheritance wouldn't dissipate to where nobody had anything. They couldn't carry on the legacy. And so one child was going to get a sufficient amount to be able to continue the legacy. And since Esau was born first, he deserved the birthright. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, it talks about not denying the birthright to the firstborn to get the double portion. And what was Esau's response? It's not going to do me any good if I starve to death. Yeah, he was really about to. I'm sure you've had children say the same thing to you, that they're going to die if they don't get something to eat or drink. And so Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank. And then at the end of verse 34, it tells what the problem is. He despised his birth. Esau despised his birthright. It shows what his attitude was toward what he had been given, and he really had no regard for it. It was not that. It was less important to him than a bowl of lentil stew. In chapter 26, there is a famine, which is a great surprise, and so. Isaac decides to go to another country where they have food, and where does he go? To Gerar, to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. Now we've seen someone named Abimelech earlier in a dealing with Abraham, and we have no way of knowing if it's the same one. It may be one of those names that's passed down from ruler to ruler to ruler, and that's more likely because of the time here. But on the way, what promise does God make to Isaac? Verse 4, there's that promise again. He will do three things. He will multiply his descendants as the stars of the heaven. He would give them all those lands. And by his descendants or his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So Isaac moved to Gerar, but when he got there, what did he say? What did he tell the people? What did his father tell the people? In verse 7. He said that Rebekah was his sister because he was afraid that they might kill him because of Rebekah, because she was beautiful. Where did he learn that? His father had done it twice in Egypt and then with another, or perhaps the same Abimelech in Gerar. But Abimelech happens to be looking out the window and he sees Isaac caressing Rebekah and he says, "You are not brother and sister. Why did you tell me that lie?" And Isaac said, "I didn't want to die because of her." And so Abimelech ordered everybody to leave her alone. Now, how successful was Isaac? He was really successful. He would plant, and what kind of a crop would he get? 100-fold. Apparently a 60-fold was a really good crop in that area. 100-fold was exceptional. And so in verses 13 and 14, how rich is Isaac? I wonder how wealthy, very wealthy he is. Go back to chapter 12 and verse 16. What does Pharaoh do for Abraham or Abram? He gave him sheep, oxen, donkeys, male and female servants, male and female, or female donkeys and camels, rather. And so Pharaoh gave him a lot of stuff. And then in chapter 13, verse 2, just how rich is Abram? Very rich in silver and in gold. And then in chapter 20 and verse 14, after Abraham had deceived Abimelech, just as Pharaoh had given Abram a lot of possessions, in Genesis 20:14, what does Abimelech do? Abimelech gives him sheep and oxen and servants and gives them to him. And then in chapter 25, verse 5, what does Abraham do with everything that he has? He gives it all to Isaac. Now, he gives a little bit to his other children, but he basically gives everything to Isaac. So how rich is Isaac just from his inheritance from Abraham? And then here in chapter 26, as Isaac sows and reaps, he becomes richer and richer and richer and becomes very wealthy. We're talking about one rich man.
It's funny how back talking about Abraham, it says, didn't it say very rich? But Isaac is very wealthy.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's a difference or not. Here, the wealthy may actually mean very great. You know, he was really a big shot.
It was so big that the Philistines envied him.
Yeah, they were envying him, probably to the extent of being afraid of him. But something creates a tension here, a tension between Isaac's servants and the Philistines. And what creates the tension?
So one thing is Abimelech says, go away because you're too powerful.
Yeah, the first thing is Abimelech says in verse 16 to go away because they're too powerful. But back in verse 15, there's something else that creates an additional conflict. The wells. Why did the Philistines plug up those wells? They probably, it just says after they stopped the wells that Abram had dug, or his servants had dug, but it was probably close to the time that Isaac was there to get Isaac out of there. If Isaac did not have access to water, he'd be forced to move farther and farther away. And so Abraham had dug a well, and they had stopped it up. Isaac opened the wells back up and then gave them back the name that Abraham had given them. Now, apparently not only had they plugged them up, but they had changed the names of them. And so he gave them the name that Abraham had dug, and they quarreled about it, and the Philistines said, "It's our water. The water's ours." What did they name the first well then? Esek, which means contention, because they contended with each other. And then, so they dug another well, and they quarreled over it, and what did they name that? Sitnah, which means enmity, and contention and enmity. And so he moved away and dug another well, and they didn't fight over it, and so what did he name it? Rehoboth. And Rehoboth means broad places. They named it after a hospital in Gallup, New Mexico. Just east of Gallup, there's it's a private hospital. There's a mission. They're just east of Gallup, and their hospital is named Rehoboth. The whole compound is called Rehoboth, and that's where our twins were born, at Rehoboth. That's where Kim Vasper went when she fell off the roof too. And so Rehoboth is a really great place. We love Rehoboth. So that's a good name for a well and for a hospital. He goes up to Beersheba, and God appears to him, and what does God promise him there? I will bless you, multiply your descendants for the sake of Abram. And also notice something that God often says, and his angels often say, do not fear. Don't be afraid, because I am with you.
He also identifies himself as the God of Abraham.
Yeah, I am the God of your father Abraham. I wonder if it would have an impact on our lives if we'd memorize that second line, do not fear, for I am with you. Just automatically pop up in our minds whenever we encounter something. Verse 25, we've seen from place to place where it talks about somebody calling on the name of the Lord. And it's usually in connection with building an altar, offering a sacrifice, and worshiping God. Abimelech had run him off and said, we don't want you around. But Abimelech comes with his advisor and the commander of his army. And I don't know if Isaac was a little bit worried when he saw this group coming, but what does Isaac say to them? Why have you come? You hate me. You sent me away. And what was their response? We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. That'd be pretty obvious when you see everything that he's receiving. And so they want to make an oath, a covenant between the two parties. And the oath is that he will not do any harm to them, and they have not touched him or haven't done anything but good to him, and that he has gone away in peace. So they had a feast and ate and drank, exchanged oaths, and then they parted in peace.
But that wasn't quite true on Abimelech's part anyway, because they wasn't really nice to him.
Yeah, a lot of times these treaties are not quite what they're cracked up to be. That same day, Isaac's servants told him about a well that they had dug and found water, and he called it Sheba, or Sheba, and so they called the city Beersheba. The last few verses go back to Esau, and how old was Esau when he married Judith? He was 40 when he married Judith, and base math. And what kind of how does his choice of wives affect his parents? his wives make life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. It gives them bitterness of spirit. As we finished last time in chapter 25, we noticed that Ishmael's choice of wives was not in keeping with what his parents wanted. And so now Esau's following that same example. Chapter 27 is a story that you're all familiar with. Isaac is getting elderly. It's interesting that he's getting old, and then we have a story that lasts about 20 years. And so he's getting really old, but he's going to be around for a while longer.
He would have been 100 when it says Esau was 40 when he got married.
Esau was 40.
So Isaac was 60 when he was born.
Yeah, so that'd be right. Yeah. Isaac is blind. His eyes are too dim to see. And so in addition to the birthright of the firstborn, another privilege was a blessing. And quite often the oldest son would also receive a special blessing. Esau had forfeited his birthright, but Isaac still had this blessing to give to him. And so he calls his older son in and says, I don't know how long I'm going to live, and so please take your hunting gear and go out in the field and get some game for me and prepare a savory dish, a flavorful dish, so that I can eat it and I can bless you before I die. And it's a reasonable request that he wants to have this special meal, and then he can give the blessing. Now, quite often a meal was associated with something special. We just saw the pact between Abimelech and Isaac, and it was consecrated by eating, by a meal together. When the three came to Abraham's tent, Abraham insisted that they stop and eat a meal with him. And so that was a big deal back then, the relationship in eating a meal. So be sure you come tomorrow night to our Valentine supper, and we will eat a meal together, and that's a free ad for the thing tomorrow night, Don. No extra charge. But for all this time, for all this history, eating together has been a special time. Just to eat and to visit and to enjoy our time together. Now, Rebekah overheard this conversation. Rebekah heard what Isaac told Esau. And so what's going on in Rebekah's mind?
She wants Jacob to get blessed.
Yeah, she wants Jacob to get the blessing. And so she wants to trick Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing that belongs to Esau. So what's her plan? To dress him up like Esau. That's only going to catch part of it. He had smell like him, and so the clothes would give him the smell. But Esau was hairy and he was smooth. She had him go out to the flock and take 2 kids, 2 goats, and that she will make the meal exactly the way that Isaac loves it. But then she would use the skins to put on his hands and on his neck. I do not know how that worked. Chuck?
Make a comment about, back the last 2 verses of 26, it talks about Esau getting married and who he married, and that they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah, and then here Jacob or Isaac is wanting to bless Esau or bless Isaac, and I wonder if Rebekah's part of her motivation was what Isaac, what Esau had done, you know, and and that she felt that he did not deserve it. You
That-
know, I think that's part of her motivation.
I think you may very well be right that she was concerned, since he had demonstrated the kind of attitude that he had, she was concerned with what he would do if he had the blessing. She probably figured he wouldn't handle it right. He had already demonstrated that he didn't handle his birthright right. He had already demonstrated that he didn't choose his wives right. And so you may be right there, may be a good point, that she was concerned about how he would use him. And definitely she preferred Jacob over Esau. And so those two working together led to this plan. And Jacob is hesitant. He's saying, you know, he's going to discover this, and he's going to give me a curse instead of a blessing. But she talks him into it, and she makes the food. And then she puts Esau's best clothing on him and puts the skins on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck and gave him the savory food and the bread. And so he went into Isaac, and he says, "My father," and what does Isaac respond? "Here I am, who are you?" "My son." So when do you think that Isaac suspects something's fishy? I think from the moment Jacob walks in and says, "My father," Isaac may be suspicious that something's going on. And later on he'll mention the voice. And Jacob, he doesn't trick him, he doesn't deceive him, he just flat out lies to him. And there is no way around this. He just flat out lies to him because he says, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I've done what you told me. And go ahead and please sit up and eat this game so that you can bless me." And so there's no way to get around it. He just flat out lied. And so Isaac's still wondering, and what's his next question? How'd you get this so fast? You know, you're going out and hunting wild game. How did you get this so quickly? And Jacob's response was, now he drags God into it.
I think that is so bold. That just makes me crazy.
That's, to me, that's worse than the "I am Esau, your firstborn," to drag God into it and say, "I got here fast because God gave me success."
The Lord your God.
Yeah, the Lord your God caused it to happen to me. And so not only is he lying, he's dragging God into his lie. What's that? Yeah, he couldn't say, "I got I'm over in the goats, and there are a couple of little kids over there," and so he just, I don't know.
Happened to be this.
Yeah.
Happened to be this deer over
Yeah, I stepped outside my tent with my bow and arrow, and there it was, and I got it right then, and Isaac is still not convinced, and so what does he say? Come on closer, so I need to touch you and see if you really are my son Esau. And so Jacob came near, and Isaac touched him. And here's where we see that from the very first word out of Jacob's mouth, he probably was a little bit suspicious, because what does he say? The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And so he didn't recognize him by feel because his hands were hairy. And again, I don't know how that works. I think you'd be able to tell apparently you couldn't, but I think you'd be able to tell a goat's skin wrapped around somebody's hand or neck. But yeah, because it's going to have an edge on it. It worked.
I got a question.
Okay.
When you go back to where Esau gives up his birthright, at that point, you know, he's pretty much despising God at that point, because he was in the lineage to grab Abraham's blessing when Isaac passed away.
Yeah.
And here it is, it's being fulfilled that that birthright is being given to Jacob. So
Yeah.
what will happen to him if he's not blessed.
Yeah. And he is trying to get that birthright, I mean, that blessing, which I would hope by then there was a big deal in the family because it had been given to Abraham so many times and Isaac so many times. But it is true that God's already said from the time that before they were born, that the weaker was going to dominate the stronger, the younger is going to dominate the older. And but that's no excuse for doing what he does the way he does it.
Right. But it's just interesting that he's doing that, but he's already been given his brother already gave the birthright to him.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's interesting to know how it would have gone if this whole deception wouldn't have taken place. Would God have still been able to carry out his promise if this deception wouldn't have taken place? I don't think God was limited to a deception like this to carry out what he was planning on doing.
This is really at the hands of Rebecca.
Yeah, Rebecca's really the one behind this because Jacob says he's going to find me out, he's going to give me a curse. And in verse 13 she says, the curse be on me. Just do what I'm telling you. And so, yeah, she's the instigator of the whole thing. He's still not convinced. And so in verse 24, what does Isaac say? Are you really my son Esau? And Jacob says, yes, I am. I am. He says, okay, bring me the food so I can eat it and bless you. And as he brought the food, what did Isaac do? Come close so I can kiss you. And we got close enough to kiss him. Then Isaac smelled his clothes, and it was the smell of Esau. And so that was the last thing for him was the smell of the garments. Rebecca had it all figured out. I mean, you have to give her credit for her plan. She was pretty conniving, but she covered all the bases. She covered the feel and the smell with her deception. And so he gives this blessing here. Now, this isn't the same promise. God will make the promise to Jacob himself. But the blessing is what?
Curse be those who curse you, and blessed those
That's it. Curse those who curse you and bless those who curse you. All nations will bow down to you, and you'll be master of your brothers. And may your mother's sons bow down to you. Jacob, as soon as he ate the food, Jacob got out of there. He was out of the tent. As soon as he got that blessing, Jacob left. And just at that same time, what happened? Here comes Esau. Esau comes in, what does he say? Here's your food. Here, eat this game so that you can bless me. Here's what you've been waiting for. And Isaac said, who are you? And he says,
I am your son, your firstborn, Esau.
Interesting. We've already heard that.
Only this time it's true.
No, this time it's true. What's Isaac's reaction?
He gets violent and true.
He is trembling violently. And then what does he say?
Who was it?
If you're Esau, who just came in and gave me food, and I blessed him. And so what's Esau's response to that? An exceeding great and bitter cry. There was a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth going on in that tent right then because Isaac is extremely upset because he's been deceived. Esau is extremely upset because he has lost his blessing. And so he begs his father to give him a blessing. And Isaac said, your brother came in deceitfully and has taken away your blessing. There's something special about this blessing. You'd think it could be undone if it was intended for Isaac for Esau, that Isaac could say that didn't count because it was a trick. And so But once the blessing was given, it was given, and you couldn't take it back. Now Esau begs him. He said, "Don't you have another one? You know, just give me some blessing." And he's weeping and crying. And basically, in verse 39, Isaac says that he's going to live away from others, and he will live by his sword, and he will serve his brother. But one little thing he could put in there was what? When you become restless, you will break his yoke from your neck. And so he had placed a yoke on him, that he would serve his brother, but he added this little part in there that he would be able to break that yoke eventually.
Now, he says, back up in verse 36, is he not rightly named Jacob, for he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken my blessing. Well, he was half right.
Yeah, that's one of those half.
He gave his blessing.
Yeah, the first half isn't true because Jacob didn't take that from him. He gave it away. Jacob gave him a cheap deal. I mean, he gave him a bowl of lentil soup for it. But I don't know if he had a receipt, if it had a money-back guarantee or what. But he noticed that he blames Jacob for both times, and really he was at fault that first time around. So what's Esau's response to this? He bore a grudge. This is a whole lot more than good old-fashioned sibling rivalry. And in fact, what was Esau saying? At least to himself. My father's going to die, and then we're going to go through the mourning process for my father. And as soon as we're through mourning my father, I am going to kill my brother. I don't think right now it's an exaggeration. I don't think it's a figure of speech. I think he has every intention of killing his brother, literally.
But after his father is gone.
20 years in the future, things will be different. But at this time, I think he has every intention of paying Jacob back. Yeah, one way to get the inheritance, eliminate the competition, and it's yours. And remember, we're talking about a lot of stuff here that's at stake. What Esau was saying made it back to Rebekah about as soon as Isaac was dead, he was going to kill Jacob. And said, Esau's consoling himself. He's got a plan to kill you, and that makes him okay. And so what is her advice to Jacob? Go to Haran to my brother Laban. And in verse 44, what's the time frame here? Just a few days till your brother's fury subsides. And so that was her plan, that he would go. I think a few days is probably not exactly what she had in mind since it was such a long trip.
It's interesting that she says to him, until your brother's anger against you subsides and he forgets what you did.
Yeah, does she really believe verse 45?
I know, right?
And just a little bit of time and he'll forget all about it.
And I like what she says, what you did to him.
Yeah. Yeah, what you did to him, he'll get over what you did to him. A lot of this is reminiscent of Adam and Eve in the garden, passing the blame on somebody else, and bringing God into it. The woman you gave me made me do it.
Gary, I want to comment on this back when she's, when Jacob is hesitant to do this, and he says, if he's found out, then he will be as a deceiver in Isaac's sight, and I will bring a curse upon myself. though she's behind this, Jacob is still going to get.
Yeah, he's going to.
Isaac is not going to forgive Jacob for
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
You know, and Jacob is the one that's going to lose on it. If he's found out, if he was found out, he would be the one that would lose, no matter what Rebecca did.
yeah. No, he's the one that put it all on the line. Yeah, she wasn't really putting out a big risk.
So, you know, that part always got me. You know, it's like, well, yeah, the curse be on me.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
Not likely.
not like it would be Jacob.
No. And as I say, I don't know if she really believes a few days is going to smooth this over or not. But you have to wonder, at this point, what has all of this benefited Jacob?
The birthright never did come about.
Yeah, the birthright, the double portion. I mean, if he's gone somewhere else, what good is that going to do him?
The blessing he would have gotten anyway, because Rebecca was told by the Lord that it was going to be that way, but she had to take it in her own hands to make it
Yeah.
happen, she thought.
And so she'd come up with her way to do it. But at this point, Jacob basically has nothing of what he had worked so hard for. You know, he has this blessing, but he's really not going to dominate his brother if his brother's going to kill him, and he's got to get out of there. And the birthright, the double portion part, he's got nothing. And so, right now, his deception has earned him 0. He's lost everything that he had. Even a third of, if his brother got a double portion, he got a third. He would have been a whole lot better off than he was at this point. How does Rebekah get Isaac to agree with sending Jacob away?
She tells him that she doesn't want him to marry someone who's from Canaan because all of Esau's wives are making her life miserable.
Right. She says that I don't even want to live because of the wives that Esau has chosen. I'm tired of living. I'm tired of my life. If Jacob takes a wife from some local family, then my life is worthless. It's over. And so her reasoning with Isaac is it's going to kill me if he marries one of these girls. So please send him away to get a wife.
You know, and I think probably one reason why Isaac was agreeable to this was, as it said back previously, is that they were caused grief to both Isaac and Rebecca.
Yeah.
So he was probably feeling the negativity or whatever it was that they were doing. He probably agreed with Rebecca on that part.
Yeah, I think he definitely felt that way about the choice of wives.
Makes you wonder what they did. And they knew
It's
that Abraham had felt the same way.
Yeah, they knew that Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and the servant said, "Well, if she won't come back, how about if I choose somebody from around here?" And Abraham said, "Absolutely not. That is not an option." And so I would hope that they were aware of that. And Ishmael may have been aware of that when he decided to choose the wives that he chose. Esau may have been aware of that when he chose the wives that he chose, that it was in direct violation of Abraham's wish that his children, grandchildren, not marry local people.
Which goes back to his attitude, Esau's attitude toward the whole thing, with his low opinion of the blessing, his low opinion of his parents' wishes, and everything by just doing what he wanted to do.
Yeah, he didn't have much regard for what was supposed to be done. What lesson can we get from the fact that God keeps repeating these promises? How many times have we seen this promise to Abraham over and over again, and now to Isaac? And it's not through; it's going to be repeated to Jacob. What lesson is there for us in that? It's what?
God doesn't forget.
God doesn't forget. Okay? He means what he says, and he doesn't want us to forget either. We know God's not going to forget, but we have a tendency to forget. God has promised this, but Now, how much of that promise did Abraham personally experience?
A seed. He just got one
He's-
kid out of it.
Yeah, he got the best part. We talked about that last time. He got to see the seed part in connection with that sacrifice of Isaac. So he did get to see the very best part. As far as the physical part, the land and lots of descendants, he was a nomad. But God wanted him to be reminded and reminded and reminded that God will fulfill all those promises, but not during his lifetime. And Isaac, God repeats these promises to help him understand that God will keep the promises, maybe not on his time frame. And God repeats it to Jacob. And we just need to be reminded that God will keep his promises. It may not be on our time frame, our schedule, but God will do what he said to do.
2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9.
Yeah, that's a good point, good passage to make that point, that with God 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. You know, we think in terms of the next 5 minutes, but God doesn't see things the same way. And he's not slow about his promise, but he's patient. And so today, as we see God's promises and we don't think they're being fulfilled, we need to understand that everything's in God's time, and God is gearing things to save as many people as possible today. As we said, did they really have to deceive Isaac in order to accomplish the purpose that God had set out?
You know, even if Esau would have gotten the blessing, God's will would have still been done.
Yeah. And what God had planned would have still been done no matter what. So, what are the good outcomes of deception? How about today? I mean, you see the outcome of deception then, the friction, and Jacob had to leave, and a lot of these things fit into God's plan, but it's not that God necessarily made them happen that way. But you see all the consequences of the deception and the hatred and how much Esau hated his brother, and he despised his birthright. But there's the deception of what they did.
He knew his parents didn't want him to take those wives. He did that to be contentious.
Yeah, and Esau did that. But it's just, sometimes we're tricked into thinking that the end justifies the means, that it's okay to be a little bit deceptive here if it's for a good cause. And the results of deception are not going to be good. They're not going to be favorable. And then the other question down there is about the favoritism. Isaac loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob. And what happened then? What was the result of that?
It would have been much better if Isaac and Rebekah had loved each other.
If they would have loved each other and loved their children and loved God, and it would have been so much better. And are there any dangers in favoritism in the church today? The same dangers exist when you start choosing sides and playing favorites. There again, it's like deception. Favoritism is a dangerous thing. And I think that what we've seen tonight was fueled partially by that favoritism. Rebekah was working for Jacob against Esau, and it just was not a good outcome. Be sure and pick up your sheet for next week and do your extensive reading every day to prepare for the next lessons. Thank you very much.